Good afternoon. My name is Doug. This is my brother Richard. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be taking a look at some of the prolific mineral locations in Bisbee, in the western part of the district. The definition that we're using is for prolific is not only just large quantities of material, but we're going to have to put a standard that it is specimen quality, okay, not ore grade through there. So for the people that don't realize, Bisbee's located 7 miles from the Mexican border north and about 20 miles south of Tombstone. And like Tombstone, Bisbee is a mining camp. And they started both in 1877. Now, mining in Bisbee would continue until 1975. And mining is drilling, blasting, breaking rock. Copper production in Bisbee lasted till 2013, and that was through leaching, which is basically dissolving the copper out of the rocks. Now, most people don't realize, though, there was a time when Bisbee stopped producing copper, okay? And the main focus was lead zinc. And this was just after World War II when the copper price dropped, okay? And this lasted till the middle 1950s. Now, the mines that we're going to look at today, the locations, one is going to be in the Holbrook mine. And then we're going to move off into the Czar mine. And then we're going to finish up in the Southwest mine. But we need to start with a real basic geology. Now, I may oversimplify this a little bit because I did not realize on the audience level. So, Bisbee's a copper porphyry. And simply what we had is 3,000 feet of limestone deposited. We had a volcanic intrusion come up through this, up along the Dividend Fault. And the Dividend Fault, let's see if I can get that to work. Oh, come on. The Dividend Fault is right in there. Oh, that thing's got a lot of lag to it. Right there. And when it came up through there, it broke up the limestones, which this is the area that we're going to be talking about right up in there today. Okay. The porphyry is anything marked GP or GPY. And that was the conduit for the solutions, the mineral bearing solutions coming up. Now, we had 4 episodes of mineral bearing solutions. Now, the first one that came up brought up iron. Okay, and in these solutions, they're going to have a lot of dissolved sulfur too. And it came up through, filtered into the limestone and the granite porphyry and deposited 500 million tons of pyrite. The second time it happened, it brought only not up copper or iron, but it also brought up copper. And it deposited more pyrite, but also chalcopyrite and other copper sulfides. Then we had another time, the third time brought up lead zinc. So you're getting your sphalerite and your galenas deposited. And the final episode got interesting. It brought up a suite of elements like tellurium, bismuth, arsenic. It's mine. Okay. So we're going to talk about one of the most impressionable localities that I remember. Never collected it, but I remember seeing it all over the floor of the house. Malachite from the Holbrook extension. Okay. Now we have to understand the same malachite had been mined in the Holbrook mine. The underground mine's much earlier, but the most of it, the bulk of it, the 11,000 pounds of malachite that came out, that is most available, came out during the open pit operations. It's very difficult to tell the difference between an old piece and a new piece. Typically, you just have to know its provenance to identify that. The Holbrook area is shown right here. And in 1881, it was starting to be developed. And let's see, here's the Holbrook number 1 shaft right here. And it started developing, the shaft itself started to develop in the mid-1880s. It went through an extremely rich area, and they basically ended up stoping too close to the shaft. So in 1906, they lost the first 100 feet of the shaft. It collapsed. And they, as sort of in an emergency, they reopened they opened the Holbrook number 2, which is right over here. And that continued. The Holbrook number 2 was 200 feet deeper. It went down to the 400, and it continued to mine until 1926, when that shaft was abandoned. Now, when you start looking at the records of the history of the Holbrook mine, you'll notice it doesn't stop until 1943. Neither of the Holbrook shafts operated after 26, but this ground was mined through several little, what were originally ventilation shafts, like the Sharon and the Young. And then the bulk of the ore was actually mined out through the Sacramento, which is on the other, it's actually almost behind that head frame on the other side of that hill. The Sacramento mine on the 400 level went out and it pulled the Holbrook ore. Now, if you read the histories, it's going to say the Holbrook is producing. It is all credited to the Holbrook. To a mineral collector, that causes a problem, because I've seen so many collections and it's almost all Sacramento material and then a whole bunch of Holbrook material. And the reason is that it was coming out the Sacramento shaft, but it was mining Holbrook ground. Okay, so when we do a mineral label, we will label it Holbrook because that's indicating the exact location, not the mine it came out of, but where the spot is found. And with the understanding is that, with the exception of the Holbrook, like most of the areas in the Ozar, still potentially could produce mineral specimens. Okay, difficult, very challenging, but we want to preserve the exact spot. And so this operated until 1943, and then it was completely shut down. And then the Holbrook extension of the Lavender Pit was started in 1960 to mine through the Holbrook mines. So they're both almost completely gone. There are a few scattered workings, and the bottom 2 levels of the number 2 are still in the bottom of the pit. You can't see them, but they're there. The malachite we're going to talk about, well, it formed right in 2 benches off the bottom, right about where the little arrow is where it was found. It was found Thanksgiving week, 1969. This photograph, unfortunately, is taken just about 2 years later, a little bit over 2 years later, and the pit had gone below that level. Now, the malachite was located, okay, you had 2 square set stopes that had been mined, and they intended to continue mining them, but the ground conditions got so bad that they could not mine the pillar in between the 2 stopes. So they just finished backfilling the stopes and abandoned it. And so when the Lavender Pit came through, they struck the malachite. Now, the malachite was rather impressive. It was 20 meters long, okay, 1 meter wide, and about 60 centimeters thick. So this is a massive amount. As I said, they predicted it was about 11,000 pounds right there. And you had that section of malachite, and then sort of underneath it and around it, you had more of what we would, you can see on the side here, it's silica fragments with limonite shot through, and it's like a breccia, and the malachite is acting as the cement to that, and very indicative. Then you were getting, and this is what I remember as a kid, lots of these large blocks that were nice, hard, dark surface, almost Russian-like, actually. And they went anywhere, well, I've seen some small ones, 3, 4 pounds, well, 1 kilogram, 2 kilograms, and then they go up to 90 kilograms is the largest one that I know of. And these are sort of modest sizes. Ones in the 20 kilogram range are not particularly rare. I know 3 or 4 that are still laying around Bisbee. Not necessarily great specimens, but they're nice blocks. Now, this is a 90 pound, or 90 kilogram, excuse me, block that's sitting at the Den mine after it was collected. I know of at least 2 other samples that were almost this size, just not quite, I would guess. Maybe they're in the 70, 80 kilogram range. But they didn't, like this one, it just didn't have a really nice surface. There's just a little bit of a nice surface there. So I imagine that they were all cut up and polished. Then another very dominant type of malachite or variety is, you can see in the upper two pictures here, you can see it sort of has a satiny luster on it, and they have nice forms. The problem with this, well, it's not a problem, it's just the fact of life actually is, let's see, you can see the little white spots. Those are damage marks, and almost all of them had it either from the pillar being crushed or the blast from the pit, because those were heavy blasts that came into it. Now, miners in Bisbee did something that, well, we could argue whether it was good or bad later. I wasn't thrilled at it as a kid. I probably wasn't really appreciative. These bottom two, this one and this one right here, originally had a badly charred up surface. And a miner, obviously, what they did is they would take a weak hydrochloric acid and it turns this satiny into a sort of a velvety. The problem with that is that, let's see if I can get it over here. Oh, wrong one. I mean, just backed up my slides. Okay. This one right here, that's a damaged section, but it's velvety now because they coated it in acid. The other problem is that the side patterns get sort of a white cast to them. So they're really very evident, and I've had some where you can smell the acid on them. So just be aware, if you're looking at one, that was done by the miners pretty regularly. They would do that. And some of them were so badly scarred, it wouldn't have mattered. But I've seen some nice specimens end up that way too. But they were naturally like the top two, and then they'd been modified below. And then we wanted to talk about very typical features. Over here in the first block, you can see the iron stained quartz fragments. That is very indicative of this locality. You don't see this typically on African malachite. Like if you go on the internet right now, I would say 80 to 90% of your Bisbee malachite is African. But if you see these quartz fragments, iron stained quartz fragments, that's a strong indication it's a Bisbee. Another thing that we have is, like in this photo over here, you see this plumose structure coming up, okay, sort of open plumose structure, and then it's capped by this thick, hard banding on top. That's also very indicative of any malachite that gets over a couple centimeters thick in Bisbee. It tends to have that plumose structure in the Holbrook mine, okay, in the Holbrook extension area. And then it gets that hard banding. And then this bottom one, you can see it starts out with the iron oxide with the little quartz fragments. It's hard to see in this case, but when you're holding the piece, you can see the plumose structure, and then it's capped by that harder banding. Another thing is, and it just doesn't occur really on very many Bisbee malachites, is that on the African, you often have this late generation that's very bright and sparkly. You do get that in Bisbee, but it's really pretty rare. And so if you have a specimen and you're trying to decide whether it's Bisbee or not, and you see that bright, sparkly later generation, you might want to avoid it. Not all of them, but many of them are not. Now we're going to take a look at the azurite locality and the 200 ZAR. This is Bisbee's greatest locality. Now, in the early years, Bisbee did hit azurite, large crystals, okay? We're going to be looking at something a little bit later in 1895. Now, the ZAR shaft was sunk in 1884. It was developed to mine the Atlanta ore body, okay? By 1884, the Copper Queen shaft had become antiquated and just was not set up for production. I know Thursday, I took a group of people down in and we took a look at the Copper Queen shaft and pointed out the features on that and how small it really is. Now the shaft here itself is the white building right there. It's done in the Eastern style where they put a building over a steel gallows frame or head frame. Now the Czar would run up until 1943, but Phelps Dodge pretty much ceased its operations in it in 1929. After that, the Czar was leased, and basically it's just a bunch of small independent miners would go in and rob scraps of ore that were left behind. And you guys, most of you guys are probably familiar with this locality. There's still, even after 127 years ago when they mined it, there's still thousands of these pieces out. Very typical. They're going to be on goethite, azurite, little azurite rosettes. Let me turn it down. Oh, there. Little azurite rosettes with a little scattering of little about 1 millimeter octahedral cuprites that are altering to malachite on there. Now, where was it found? Okay, 200 level Czar. So let me show you where the Czar shaft is right there. The Copper Queen shaft is right there. Right up there is the old Southwest ore body, and it was an extension off his right there, an extension off the old Southwest ore body. What happened is they were driving drift and they intercepted a cave. Now the cave been fairly well described. It's curved in length, about 50 feet, about 20 feet wide, and about 15 feet tall. The origins of it. Okay, this cave was in a marginal crack in there, and what's happening? Just to note, the cave was lined with azurite, some malachite, and the little tiny cuprite coated malachite. Yeah. Now, in Bisbee, the secondary, okay, we have a primary ore body. This would have been at one time pyrite and chalcopyrite. Due to erosion and uplift, the ore bodies in the western part of the district got pushed close to the surface, and surface waters came in and started oxidizing, and it mobilized the copper, the iron, etc. And when it was going down in there, the sulfur. And the sulfur just gets leached out, and when that sulfur disappears, there's a reduction in volume. So you have the rooms appear above the ore bodies. These start to collapse, and of course you can see the bed sagging. But more importantly, in this case, we get these marginal cracks develop on the sides of the ore. It's right there on the sides. Now, right there is where this cave was hit on one of these, just right on the boundaries. Now, when you're in an ore body in Bisbee, they're somewhat layered, okay? Because remember, azurite and malachite are copper carbonates. The source of the carbonate is the limestone. So expect to find that stuff right there close to the contacts. Now, when you guys start losing the carbonate towards the centers of the ore in these isolated spots, you're going to end up starting getting cuprite deposited, copper oxide. And then finally, when there's no more oxygen, what's coming out is it's precipitating out native copper. Okay, so when you look at a Bisbee copper, it's going to be a secondary copper. We have no primary copper there. Now, from this locality, the azurite, the form is coming from the goethite. Okay, this was when this cave was deposited, it was first came in as goethite. Okay, and in here we're looking at stalactites of goethite that have been coated with 1 millimeter azurites. The one on the left is just a single stalactite, and the one on the right is actually a group of 3 parallel stalactites on that. Now this is the more typical of the material with the little azurite rosettes. Now how this was deposited, the cave was first goethite. Then malachite got deposited. It's kind of ugly until it's broken. When you see the broken pieces, they're going to be the most brilliant chatoyance that Bisbee ever produced, malachite. Then the cave got filled in full of water, at least mostly filled. And you see the first deposition azurite. And they're mostly the little roses, but there's some other types we'll take a look at here in a second. Then the little cuprites came in, which later got altered to malachite, or just partially altered, because inside the core of these, if you break the little cuprites, they're generally still a little bit of cuprite inside of them. And then one final stage of deposition of the cave flooded again, and had a real quick bright azurite go across some of the stuff. And here you can see in the lower parts of the cave and down in the breakdown material, we've gotten larger crystals inside the pools starting to develop. There's one there. There's one there. And up in the upper reaches, no azurite at all. All you do is have goethite, malachite there, and little sprinklings of cuprite crystals that have been altered on that. And they get quite large. The one on the left is in the Smithsonian. It's currently on display. Okay. And on the one on the right, you can start seeing the bright chatoyant malachite on top of it. And you can see, just peeking through, which I forgot to mention, on top of the malachite, you always generally have this real quick iron stain on a lot of it. So, typical features of the locality: the little octahedrons are altering to malachite. Okay, they're just small, 1 millimeter or so, and that's it. The other one is you're gonna see some goethite. Okay, this one up at the top, when they collected it, it just pulled away from the goethite, but there's trace amounts of it on it. The chatoyant malachite, it's super, super bright. And this one's over here is very, very typical, the whole rock. You can see that ochreish goethite. It'll move all the way to black on it sometimes. It has little bits of the chatoyant malachite, the little octahedrons coated, and the little bright rosettes of azurite on there. And we're going to talk about the calcite that came out of the ballpark stope in the southwest. The ballpark is not the original name. It was a nickname the miners gave it. The official name is the New Southwest Ore Body. The Southwest mine is sort of odd because the Copper Queen had gotten itself into trouble, and that's why it was developed. In the early years, the exploration for the ore went southeast and deeper, southeast and deeper. Well, the Calumet in Arizona and its little group of associated companies basically bought up all the valuable land to the southeast, and that sort of hemmed them in. They were in trouble. And so they had to go back looking at their area of origin. So they started relooking at the area of the Atlanta ore body, the old Southwest ore body, even the Copper Queen ore body. And so they realized that nobody had explored the hill up above them. And so they started driving raises from the 200 level of the Czar, and they started hitting ore bodies. Now, originally, the ore bodies were considered part of the Czar mine. But by 1911, they developed enough ore, and they started putting adits outside of the mountain, and then they designated it the Southwest Mine. And it operated up until 1929 again, and then after 1929, it operated under leases until 1943, when it was shut down completely. Now, the new Southwest ore body is, let's see if we can get this, is right here. Okay, and I'm showing it on the 5th level, which is basically the bottom. It only went a few feet below that. To give you, if you know Bisbee, this is the Sunrise shaft, which is the main man and material shaft. And then we have the Higgins, and then the Southwest shaft, which you had visited on the tour, would actually just be off the map, and it would be right there. Probably what is more of an interest is the view of the ore bodies in general. We have the new southwest ore body right here. Goes up to about right there and forward. And then over here's the Atlanta and the old southwest ore body. And then there's some other ore bodies shown on here as well. So this is a massive ore body. It's 1.2 million tons. And that caused some problems for the mining, actually. Well, first let's talk about the ores. The ores in the Southwest, Uncle Sam, Cuprite, and the majority of the Shattuck ores are all associated with the silica breccia. And the silica breccias were definitely not well understood when they were mining, and they're still not totally understood today. But silicious bearing solutions came off the stock or out of the area of the porphyry. They came in, broke up the Paleozoic limestones, and they silicified the limestone. They replaced the limestone fragments with quartz and a large amount of specular hematite. And you can see the right here is the one of the number of silica breccia outcrops above Bisbee, and then the other picture shows one that is underground in the southwest ore body, or new southwest ore body. But the size of the ore body did cause a problem, because when they were done mining, they did something that was unheard of in Bisbee. They had an open stope that was close to 2,000 feet long, extended over 200 feet tall, and was 300 feet wide. And that caused them nothing but problems. Now, they were unable to backfill it because of two primary reasons. A, they were very close to the surface. This stope goes within 60, 70 feet of the surface in places. And then the mountainous terrain up above it just did not allow for backfill to be brought in. Now understand that when you carve out a stope like this, it's extremely important to fill it back in with dirt and broken rock. Other words, it's going to collapse. And when it collapses, it's going to destroy all the mine workings around it. Okay, that's what happened to the Southwest number 2 shaft. The upper part of the Southwest shaft that's visited on the tour was wiped out this way. And so they were really concerned about that here. And as you can see, they just had to let it cave in. But luckily, it held during mining. And that causes an interesting thing. The miners never saw the good calcite out of the Southwest, the stope. They never saw it, because most of it, or many of it, is coming 60, 70 feet above the mining levels. They never had a clue it was there. Here's an example of a small crosscut that has fallen off into the stope. Let's see, you can see an eye pin right here, and you'll notice the different color in the rock. This is because of the drilling mud left on the side of the crosscut. One of the boulders is so big, there's 100-foot long crosscut going through it with the T intersection, and the track ties are still in it, and all the wire hangers and eye pins. There's a boulder with a raise going through it. It's just massive. I mean, boulders the size of the building are stacked up inside there. But it exposed all this ground that the miners never saw. And here's an example, but you can see there's a pocket there, there's another pocket back in there. And this whole area, when it was first entered, and remember, really no calcite was taken out of here before about 1965. And most of the good stuff had been removed by 1978, 79. But when they came in here for the first time, because of the collapse, it was just littered with specimens. Now, a lot of them had been damaged by the fall, but a lot of them hadn't or could be trimmed. So, I mean, literally thousands and thousands of specimens were scattered all through the stope. And we're talking about a stope that's between 1,800 and 2,000 feet long. That's a lot of territory. So this was heavily collected. And it was easily collected because initially they were just taking the stuff that was loose. And then they started looking at the stuff that was in the pockets. This is a close-up view of one of the pockets. This one was left behind because it just wasn't of interest to the collectors of the time. Now, we do get fairly decent-sized calcite crystals for Bisbee. They reach about 20 centimeters. They have nice variance in color. They go from amber honey color, which is, organics, fulvic and humic acid. You have the colorless to white, and we don't have one here, but there's lots of pinks and reds, but there are no greens. You will not see, if it has copper inclusions, it's not out of the new Southwest ore body. Yeah, it could be from another Southwest locality, but it's not from this one. Okay, and here's some in place with some fairly good-sized crystals. Again, the large crystals were not really popular with collectors at the time, and the damage that you see, like right in here, and let's see, down in here, that's not from collectors, that's from the boulders rubbing as they fell. And then here's another pocket. Again, they wouldn't have, well, they weren't interested in this because it's up against the silica breccia, and there's the chances of you actually successfully collecting a piece were very limited. They just tended to just break apart. And you can see a close-up, and you can see it's littered with debris, but again, this was from the collapse, not collecting. Now, no, this is another pocket that was left behind. Again, this one wasn't really that exciting because this down in here had been ex-solutioned, so these are rather ugly. But it did offer some potential. Now these were a different case. These were very popular in the 70s. They weren't really uncovered until about 1976, but after that they got very aggressive and they were collected very heavily. From a distance you would just think they're standard helictite actually, but when you start looking at them you can see that they're made up of little rhombohedrons anywhere from 0.5 centimeters. The largest ones, individual rhombs, don't exceed 4 centimeters, so some of them get pretty good size. And so these were extremely popular and very heavily collected, and that's why the in situ photo is not that great. You can barely see one right here making sort of a curved ring, and then there's two over here. Okay, and there's some in the back, but you can see them up in contact with the breccia. But as I said, these were very popular. They were heavily collected. And then there was a boulder about 60 tons that had fallen somewhere around 20, 25 meters. And 60 tons, that's a big rock. And it had fallen, but when it fell, it landed up against another boulder. Now, the bottom of the boulder was covered with these large light bulb-like sort of extreme popcorn calcites. Most of them had been just crushed out of existence. But and then the section that was preserved, the impact had knocked a substantial number, so they were coating the ground or the rubble underneath it. But there were quite a few that still remained relatively intact, and that's where these two came from. Several hundred specimens were collected in that area. The biggest issue, and you can notice it because this was really hard to get off, these saddle-shaped crystals at the bottom are absolutely razor sharp. And blood became a major issue because if you weren't careful, they have almost a dolomitic quality to them, so they're a little porous. You're not getting the blood stain out. It's going to be permanent, so you had to be really careful. And the strangest thing was you would cut yourself on those, and then you'd come back a week or two later, and the blood looked just like you left it, fresh and liquid. It was just weird. Okay, you would think it'd be all dry, but it wasn't. This one, the photograph doesn't do it justice, this one down here. And this came from about 200 meters on the eastern end of the stope. It was a standard, more popcorn type calcite, but the pocket had been reflooded. And so you got all these 1 or 2 millimeter crystals all over it. And they're actually really attractive. It's just, you know how it is. Sometimes the best specimens don't take good pictures. Yeah, and the ugly specimen just looks beautiful. It's one of those situations. Yeah. And then solution lines. And we'll start with an in situ photo here. The solution lines are sort of fascinating places. They're the interface between the aerial growth environment or subaerial, where it's growing in the open air, and then you have the under solution or subaqueous. And in the aerial, if your environment up in here, you're getting lots of tiny crystals forming these wonderful biomorphic shapes like stalactites and halactites and stalagmites come up in here. But down in the subaqueous, of course, we're getting what most of us are a little bit more fond of, these large, nice crystals. And they were very abundant, and you can see another water line going right across here. This one's rather ugly. The pocket is not particularly attractive, but you can see the more traditional cave type formations on the top, the halactites, stalactites. Then it goes to the water line, and it's difficult to see in a photograph, but those are covered, the bottom parts are covered with about 1 centimeter to 3 centimeter crystals of calcite. And you can see where the water line has obviously changed because you have a stalagmite and some stalactites that are passing through the water line that was there. Okay, so you start getting some interesting specimens in there. Particularly raft litter produced quite a few. Raft litter forms when you get a pool of water and you get calcium, or calcite rather, floating on the pond, on the pool, or sometimes attached to a nearby stalactite or a wall of the pocket. And after a while, either it gets too heavy or the pool is disturbed and it sinks, and then it gets exposed to this a next generation of larger calcites, and so you get some very attractive forms coming out of there. These are, again, really popular, more popular than, let's say, than the larger crystals that we looked at first. And this type was not very common, but very desirable. And again, we're looking at the in situ picture is less than pretty. You can see what has happened here. Let's get down here. You can see a solution line here, and then another one right here. And so we had a stalactite, one here, and one about over here that went down, and when the solution level raised, the calcite crystals started radiating around that stalactite, and that's what produced the one up in the corner. And you get some that look like little mushrooms, and some that are nice crystalline, such as that one. And then typical features for a new southwest ore body calcite, okay, would be you're going to have no copper minerals present, no malachite, no native copper, nothing. Because again, they were pretty far distance out of the ore body. Then you have, sometimes you will find a silica breccia fragment inside the matrix. That is actually pretty uncommon compared to the other two below. The bottom one here shows really no matrix at all. It's just cleavages. And then this one, you see a lot of specimens out of this area like this. You have a little thin film of hematite that allowed the calcite to free away from the thin film of hematite was at the contact between the calcite and the silica breccia. And so it was easy to remove that piece. And in this case, it's almost a cast. You can see the rough shape of the silica breccia boulder it was taken off of. And we could have talked forever, and there are dozens of big localities, and these three are actually in the western sections. Okay, this one has been talked about quite a bit. It's the large azurite, really glassy azurite roses that came out along the dividend stopes along in the Czar Holbrook area. They are in the eastern section, the eastern side of the western section. And that's in the Czar Holbrook mine, and then next to it we have a stope. We showed a cuprite, but it's actually better known for rare minerals. It's 14 stope out of the Southwest mine. It's better known for tolbachite and claringbolite and spangalite, things of that nature. And the 400 level Holbrook were produced masses of them out. But then you go through, and in this we're just talking about the western, and then you have the middle and the southern and the eastern section. This is out of the eastern section, which I think is probably the most important locality is in the eastern section is the 105C stope in the Campbell, which produced a lot of azurite too, but in this case, it's a malachite pseudomorph after an azurite crystal. So, but there's so much to talk about. But these are almost, in a sense, almost opposites. We're suspecting that these are very old, pre-Cretaceous, and if you told me these were 60,000 years old, I'd believe it. Yeah, so we're looking at two geological opposite ends. Yeah. And any questions? Yes.
You guys have been working on a third book.
Yes. Yes.
What's the status of that?
Well, I've been blaming Peter McGaw for this. He gave us a box of information. It's like, whoa. It turned out to be a treasure trove. It is working on it. It has like 150 pages written. And so we got a couple hundred more pages to look at. And part of it will be interpreting. See, we want to address some of the major collections that exist, and some of them that I have no clue where they are. Yeah. And like Albert Watson's collection, he prepared the Bisbee collection that was displayed at the San Francisco Exposition. And he was killed underground like 6 weeks before the exposition. So I know part of the minerals went there, or what he had prepared for, at that time it was Copper Queen, but his collection has just disappeared. So we want to address some of those collections and some of the great ones like Michael Cunningham's and things like that. And then we want to look at talking about, okay, if you have a Bisbee Shattuckite, why is it a Bisbee Shattuckite? And, how do you determine a Bisbee Shattuckite from an Aho Shattuckite? Those details, because that's disappearing rapidly. Yeah. And I'd like to say, it's a Bisbee Shattuckite because it's ugly. Because beautiful Shattuckites are automatically either Aho or African. They're not Bisbee. Yeah, Bisbee produced the world's ugliest Shattuckite, in my opinion. And I love Bisbee Shattuckite. So, but no, and you look around and so much material is being misrepresented, not intentionally necessarily. And then we want to talk about some of the great localities like the 26 stopes in the coal, and then look at the 105C in the Campbell and the 1300 pseudomorphs in the Campbell as well. And that is an interesting locality itself because it was not hit in a mining area. They were driving a ventilation raise, an access raise when they hit the large pseudomorphs on the 1300 level Campbell. So there's a lot of interesting things to handle.
What's the ETA on that?
It was supposed to be done by February, but it's not going to happen. Yeah, it's probably going to end up being next year. One thing I've learned that when you publish a book, you say it's going to be done in May. You might as well add 3 months to it. It just the way editing, it just takes forever. And then you'd say, oh, that photograph's not good enough. And then my skill with a camera is rather limited. So it takes me like 200 shots to take one decent one. So that yeah, that's going to be patient. It's going to need to be a color volume too. Because, volume 1 was color. Then to save the consumers, we did volume 2 in black and white. And volume 3 is going to need to be a color volume. To express what we needed to, or what we would like to talk about. So it's slow and
tedious.
Well, not tedious. It's exciting because you get this information and you start looking at it. It's like the cuprites on azurite. You start thinking, well, what other areas in Bisbee have cuprite on azurite? And you think 3. So what is this telling us? And then we're looking.
Talk about that in one of the first 2 volumes?
We did. We talked about this locality because There are so many wonderful azurites that came out of that. Now, the Czar produced killer malachite, killer azurites, but it's not something that you're going to go to the Tucson show and guaranteedly pick one up. One of the 1895 cave, I would be floored if you go to Tucson and you don't see a nice one for sale. I would be absolutely floored, because it's like every year we go and we find another one that is pretty decent, and I've never seen it before. You just constantly see them new. I have no clue how many thousands of specimens they took out of that thing. And there are just so many. So that's just, without a doubt, it's Bisbee's most prolific locality. I mean, there are just so many floating around, and they're good pieces. The same thing, that's why we chose these, because everything that we talked about today, it's easy for someone to acquire, relatively easy. Okay, if we talked about the big SAC second generation azurite crystals, that's much more difficult to acquire. The same thing with some of the early Atlanta ore body azurites. They probably produce 200-300, but you distribute that in the mineral world, it just disappears. You just never see them. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So over the years, I've seen specimens from the 1895 pocket
Mhm.
attributed to having been exhibited at the Columbian Exposition of 1893. So that's obviously erroneous,
Yeah,
correct?
it is.
Okay.
Yeah, because you see the collections that were there,
Yeah.
like the American Freeport stuff.
Right.
Guess what they're missing? One from that collection, from that pocket, which is rare because everybody has them. Those things were so abundant, yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
That's what I thought.
yeah. You see those marked copper queen all the time too.
Sure.
Yeah, and I get it. I do get it. It gets complex. Back then, they didn't care. It mostly referenced to Copper Queen Mining Company or Copper Queen Consolidated, and that's fine. I mean, their labeling standards were different.
Any other questions? And I'll add, those first two volumes are phenomenal. I would say that you could read everything in there and you have a full education, but I think these are the only two with full education. And they are available on Amazon, and they are a bargain when you look at the cost of books today.
I had one. What is the most mineralization, mineralogy of the tellurium and bismuth and the deposits?
It's the sulfides, and there's oxide to the gramite named after Dad. That's a tellurium mineral. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting. You get the weird things like the bromine. Yeah, it's from the limestones that's coming out of the old ocean bottoms. Yeah, and then the nitrates. That's because that stuff's super reactive, right? So there's debates on the source whether it is bat guano. Okay, was one source. There's a problem with that. When Dad was still alive, we talked about it. We think it might have been the bacteria doing the supergene enrichment, which was the source of the nitrate. Yeah, I know. So yeah,
House is out now, so how many minerals do we have in Bisbee now?
337 currently.
Anybody know a site with more? Okay, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming.
I have one last question. if you
Sure.
don't mind. I apologize if this has been asked and answered many times before, but I'm curious, how as brothers did you, together or separately, enter the mineral world and remain so impassioned?
Okay, we got to go Dad.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of these guys know Dad. Yeah, we grew up around minerals. Yeah,
Wasn't a choice, was it?
it wasn't a choice. So,
And we're twins, so we get along perfectly.
yeah, and so when we went out, we didn't go hiking with Dad. We went mineral collecting, and yeah, it
And
did.
then, I don't know, and particularly the days of the lavender pit, you'd be playing around the house and the whole floor would be covered with hundreds of azurites. And it's hard not to be impressed, even when you're just a little kid running around.
Yeah,
And then,
And then when we left Bisbee, you know, Dad would bring home Aho stuff.
Yeah.
We got a little bit of Aho stuff.
Yeah.
And then him and I both worked underground. We just, mining's definitely a way to get good rocks, guys.
You're right in the middle of it.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah, you're smacking the, yeah, and that'll keep you interested right there.
Don't forget again, Mineralogy of Arizona,